it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card for you using Lawn Fawn's Elfie Selfie, Wild for You, Bubbles of Joy, and Scripty Bubble Sentiments. So I've stamped out the images I'll be using in Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with my elephants, and for the mama I'm using W00, W1, W3, and W5. I'm going to use that W5 to lay in some shadows first. I put some on the curve of her trunk and on the tops of her ears. I'm also going to put it on her front leg and back leg that are on the opposite side of her body and would be cast in some shadow, and then on the backs of the other two legs, along her hindquarters and underneath her ear. So any place that I felt like the body would be shadowed. And then I will start to blend that out with the W3. And I'm going to just work my way around the W5 and make sure to scribble over the edge of that and kind of use that lighter color to break up the pigment of the previous color so it gets really nice and soft for blending. Once I have all of that W3 laid in, I'm going to take the W1 and I'm going to continue blending that out. I am using 4 shades on her just because she is such a large image, and it's going to give me a lot of dynamics because there will be a big difference between the darkest darks and the lightest lights. So having that extra bit of contrast will just make her that much more kind of lifted off the page and brings her to life a bit more. So once I'm done with the W1, I'll come in with my lightest shade, the W00, and I'm going to fill in any of that white space and continue coloring over the edge of the previous color so that I get a nice soft transition from shade to shade, and it kind of eliminates any harsh lines. I also want to add a bit of detail to her, but I need to let this dry first, so I'm going to move on to the babies and then come back to her. So the 2 baby elephants, I wanted them to be just a little bit lighter than the mama, so I'm going to skip over the W5 and just use the lighter 3 shades. So I'm laying in my shadows this time with that W3, and then the W1 will be my midtone and the W00 my highlight shade. So even though I absolutely adore the little mice that come in the Bubbles of Joy and the Scripty Bubble Sentiments stamp sets, I thought it would be fun to mix things up today and use the bubbles with some different critters. And I thought of these elephants because when I was a little girl, my zoo had an elephant named Shawnee, and she was my absolute favorite animal to see at the zoo. And after a little while, Shawnee had a baby, and they named the baby Bubbles. And so I loved to come to the zoo and visit Bubbles. After some time, we ended up not having an elephant at the zoo because it was a pretty small zoo. And so Bubbles was the very last elephant that we ever had. And so whenever I see Bubbles, it just makes me think of elephants and that childlike wonder of seeing those incredibly beautiful creatures. So now I'm going to come in and do that little dot detail that I mentioned and just add some personality to each of these little elephants. I'm using the W5 and the W3 on the mama, so the same that I use for the darkest 2 shades on her, is I want them to kind of fade in and just create some little spots on their skin, but not be too prominent. And then for the 2 babies, I used W3 and W1. So they also just have a little bit of detail, but it's a subtle accent. Then I'm moving on to the bottle of bubbles, and I wanted that to be a bright pink. So I chose RV13, RV14, and RV17. And I'm adding my shading on the right hand side and then also between each of those little sections just to separate them a bit more, and then blending out with the RV14, and then I'll use the RV13 as my highlight. And I will add that I do a second layer of all of my coloring off screen just to save you some time in the video, but it's just something that I really love to do. And then I'm moving on to my bubble wand and using BG05 to color that in. Then I'll come back to my elephants and I'm going to add some pink inside their ears and also give them some rosy cheeks with RV10 and RV11. I'm using that RV11 first to add a little shading into the ear and then blending that out with the RV10 and letting that fade into that light gray tone. And then I'll do the same with the babies, but I'm just going to use a little bit less of that RV10 since they're a little bit lighter. I would rather have a little bit more of the RV10 than having that darker RV11 in that area there. Once I'm happy with their ears, I will add some rosy cheeks with that RV11, just drawing a small oval shape on the cheekbone, and then using that RV10 to kind of draw a ring around it, which helps the edges fade and just gives you that natural rosy glow. Then I'm going to color in my bubbles, and I'm going to use 3 shades for those. I'm using RV00, BG000, and BV00. I added the BG000 to the top of the bubble container just to add a little shading to the cap. And now I'm going to start with the bubbles. I used the BV00 first to draw some small C shapes in that area, and then I blended over that with the RV00 and then added the BG000 just to kind of fill in, but I'm also leaving a small ring of white space around the outside edge, so I'm just bringing that circle a little bit smaller inside there. And I am going to go over each of these twice as well. You saw me do it on the one that's coming out of the bubble one just to kind of show you what I'm doing, but on the rest of them I'll do them off screen. But like I said, I'm just doing a small C shape with the BV00 first, and then blending over the edge of that with the RV00. I'm not covering up the BV00, but just adding the RV00 right on the edge of it. And then drawing the rest of the circle closed with that BG000 and filling that space in the center. The results are going to be very subtle and pale, and that is the look that I was going for today. But if you wanted your bubbles to be a bit brighter, you could replace the markers that I've chosen with another step up. So instead of RV00, you could use RV01 or RV02, and the same with the other 2 shades. You could just bump those up a little bit in that color family, and you would get a much brighter, vibrant result. So I'll just finish coloring these last few little clusters. I'm so happy that there are so many different sizes of bubbles between the 2 sets, the Bubbles of Joy and the Scripty Bubble Sentiments, because you really get a wide variety to be able to fill in your scene and just create a lot of movement. So it's really fun to mix and match Lawn Fawn sets. That's one of my favorite things to do. So now that my coloring is complete, I'm going to trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm taking the Lawn Fawn Cloudy stencil and some tumbled glass Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to blend that onto a panel of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock. So I'm pressing down a little bit harder on the edge of the stencil with my ink blending tool, so that I get a higher concentration of color right on the edge, and then kind of letting it get soft as it goes up the panel, and then turning that stencil so that I get a different cloud formation, and repeating that process. And I'll just continue to turn that stencil and fill in the sky until it looks nice and soft and cloudy. And I only really need about the top half portion of that, maybe even a little less, from how I'm going to orient today's card. But I always like to go a little bit further down than I think is necessary, just in case. And I often also like to add a little bit of splatter detail on the background, just to add a bit more movement to the scene. So I just press down my ink pad onto my work surface, add a little bit of water, pick that up with a small paintbrush, and then tap that against my finger so I get a nice fine spray of droplets. And then I'll set that panel aside to dry. I've die cut 2 more borders with the Lawn Fawn Stitch Hillside borders, and I'm going to layer those on top of each other. But first I want to blend on some more Distress Oxide ink. This time I'm using Bundled Sage and Mowed Lawn. So I'm using the Bundled Sage first and doing a little bit more than halfway down that panel. And then I will come in with the Mowed Lawn and bring that up from the bottom to meet the Bundled Sage. So I just have to move that panel so I can get my blending tool in there. And then again, just like I did with the cloud stencil, I'm pushing down more firmly at the bottom of the panel so I get a higher concentration of color, and then kind of getting a less pressure as I get toward the line where the Bundled Sage is, just so that it kind of blends softly and I get a nice smooth transition. I don't want to have any harsh lines there. So I'll do the second panel just the same, going about halfway down on this one with that Bundled Sage, and then bringing in the Mowed Lawn. And I really like the way these 2 colors blend together. And then I'm going to set those down and do some splatter detail on these as well. I'm going to press both colors onto my work surface and water those down. I'll start with the Bundled Sage, that way I don't have to clean off my brush in between. It's a little trick to start with the lighter color ink, and then I'll dip into the darker color and splatter that on the background as well. Then I'll set these panels aside to dry, and once they are completely, I'm going to pop the bottom one into my MISTI, the shorter one, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment, and I'm using a sentiment from that Scripty Bubbles stamp set, Scripty Bubble Sentiments. I stamped that down with VersaFine Onyx Black ink because some inks don't layer well on top of Distress Oxides, but I find that pigment inks do. So that's why I went with that one. And then I'm going to pop my card base in my MISTI as well. I'm using Lawn Fawn's Mermaid cardstock and Peacock ink to stamp the rest of my sentiment. And I'm doing the sending hugs and another little cluster of bubbles to just tie into the front of the card and give the recipient something a little bit more to smile about on the inside. For my pattern paper, I'm using one of the Perfectly Plaid Remix sheets. I'm going to flip through until I get to this pink and turquoise plaid, or pink and aqua. And I'm going to trim that down with the Lawn Fawn Large Stitch Rectangle Stackables. And then I'm also going to take the Lawn Fawn Small Stitch Rectangle Stackables, the largest one, and that is what I die cut my focal panel down with, so it has that nice stitching detail on all the edges as well. I will add my pattern paper to the card base first using my Lawn Fawn glue tube. Mine was a little bit clogged, so I had to use a needle to kind of clear that out. But then I just line that up on the card front and press that down into place. And I just made sure that all 4 sides lined up with the edges of the card base. Then I added the taller grassy border to my sky background. And then I'm adding the smaller grassy border with the sentiment on it in front of that on my scene. I'm going to pop up this focal panel with some Scotch 3M foam tape. I love this stuff because it's very low profile and it goes perfectly through the mail with just a regular stamp. I never have any issues with this stuff. It's just the perfect level of dimension on a card. And then I'm going to start to bring in my images, starting with the largest first. So I'm going to add my mama elephant into my scene. Before I press her trunk down, I want to add the balloon wand into the end of that, just so I have that situated just where I want it. And then I've got this stream of balloons that I wanted her to be blowing out. And in order to squeeze that onto the background piece, I needed to just adjust her a little bit. So that's why I love using liquid glue. It gives you that little bit of time to be able to manipulate your images before they adhere permanently. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to move on to my baby elephants. I'm going to put the one that is facing toward the right next to the mama, so she can be sitting there trying to catch the bubbles that are going to be coming down. And then the other little baby that is facing forward from Wild for You, I'm going to put that one down towards the sentiment on the lower grassy bank. I'm also going to add the little bottle of bubbles into that grassy bank just to kind of fill in that space down there. And then I'm going to take all of the rest of these little bubbles and continue to fill in this happy little scene. So most of those bubbles I'm going to have floating through the air, kind of caught on the breeze there, but a few of them I'm going to have floating down towards the ground or caught on the grass or the little bottle of bubbles. I thought maybe some of the mixture kind of ran down the side and collected there. So like I said, it's just really fun that you get so many different sizes because it helps you to tell that story. So I am going to save a couple little places where I want to stamp out the little bursts that they have included in the stamp sets. So there are 2 in the Bubbles of Joy and another one in the Scripty Bubble Sentiments, and they're all different sizes. So I'm going to stamp those in Manatee ink because I wanted it to be really pale, as the bubbles are also pale. So I wanted something that would just barely show up there. So I stamped down 4 of those in total, 2 of the small, 1 of the largest, and then 1 of the medium sized. And then there is also this little word pop that is included with the Bubbles of Joy. So I wanted to stamp that one next to all of those little bursts just to emphasize them and help you realize what those are supposed to be. So if you're familiar at all with my cards, I'm sure you guessed what my final embellishment was going to be. I absolutely love using stickles. I just find it so beautiful to have that little bit of sparkle that catches the light when you tip the card, and it just takes your cards to the next level, I think. So I'm going to add a little bit to each of my bubbles and just add that where the darkest highlight is, because then it stands out the most. And that's the only place I'm going to put it. I'm just going to add it to those bubbles and then call it good. So now I will pick up that card so you can see what I'm talking about. It just adds that subtle detail that really catches your eye. And then there is another peek at the inside. This card is also going to be featured on the Lawn Fawn YouTube channel today, so you can check it out there if you'd like. And if you do like it, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. It helps out my channel so much. If you're interested in any of the products I use, you'll find them listed and linked below the video. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.